Welcome, boys and girls. Cosine here with a deck building guide for Russia in Broken Arrow. As I mentioned in my video on building a deck for the Americans to handle things as a new player, it is best to choose something that is going to be versatile. You don't want to focus on one specific area to the detriment of others when you're starting out, or when you're playing with pugs in general, because you might go with something like a tank brigade as an example, or you might focus on air power. But if you don't have teammates that you know will be able to cover the deficiencies you have in those areas where you wouldn't get units, you are going to find yourself losing quite a few matches. My experience in a lot of strategy games over the years in multiplayer is that relying on pugs to do anything right is a surefire way of getting really frustrated very, very quickly. So just preventing yourself from getting in that kind of situation is really the best way to do so. So it's best to be versatile. For a starting deck, I would recommend going for something balanced. I would recommend going for a good amount of firepower in certain areas, and just having that variety of units to be able to cover all fronts. So what am I going to choose right here? Well, I am going to go with a tank brigade over here, and then I'm going to go with the VDV brigade. The reason I'm going to go with the VDV brigade is the VDV provides you some really powerful planes. Specifically, it gives you the Su-57. And the Su-57 is a great plane to really contest the skies. And this is one of the things I wish to point out with regards to air power. You would probably need good coordination among your team to really make bombing air to ground work, because you would need multiple planes being thrown at once. You would need someone to provide support from the ground with air defense, short range, long range, you name it. Ideally, you'd also want artillery, and you would need multiple aircraft to multiple roles. Like, you would need aircraft to provide top cover while your bombers are doing their job. So from my perspective, with regards to planes, it's best to just focus on controlling the skies to prevent the enemy from bombing you into oblivion. And that's where things like the Su-57 or the F-22 or F-35 can really come in. What kind of weapons do you want over here? Well, I would recommend the R-37. Having a long-range missile that can shoot down planes from a distance is going to be pretty useful. Keep in mind, this is not necessarily going to be exceptionally useful against helicopters, but that's perfectly fine. You could also go with anti-radiation missiles if you want to. Just keep in mind the downsides of installing these kind of things on an Su-57, because yes, it is a good plane, but you may want to have it focused on the air-to-air combat role. On the flip side, of course, though, if we look at the plane and just changing things around over here, we do have certain things right here. So let's just switch that. We do have R-73, an R-73 short range missile by default. So you could just focus on getting those anti-radiation missiles. In fact, it might just be the best, or putting in a cruise missile, though keep in mind the kind of costs that come with that. It is an option, and because it is a stealth aircraft, it would probably perform that role pretty well. So those are just those two planes. It's a decision on the subject, like, do you want to try and use your planes to hunt down enemy SAMs? That's going to be on you. Now, elsewhere, so you do want at least one plane type to be dedicated to air-to-air. So in this case, personally, I would just go with the R-37s over here. Now, outside of that, this is going to be a good amount of points. But outside of that, if I could get a plane for a distraction, I would. But the IL-76 is not that plane. You may want a plane that's dedicated as a platform to bomb enemy targets, and on the ground, one way or another. But not a bomber necessarily. A bomber it's an expensive thing. And unless you can guarantee that it's going to get through enemy air defenses, I would recommend not going with the bomber. Like, if you have that coordination with the team, sure. So what else would you want? Well, I would say something like an Su-34, as an example. Though any kind of plane would work really, but an Su-34 is dedicated for that specific role of air to ground. So if you want, ACM, like if you want anti-radiation, put them on Su-57s. But you could go with some anti-air missiles on this thing. But the important role that an Su-34, and yes, we can only really afford one because expensive planes are expensive. But right here, we could get a huge amount of power on this thing. Like, we do have some anti-radiation missiles right here, but it might not be worth the points on it, on the subject, as opposed to, just getting a bunch of really, really powerful bombs right here. There's all kinds of discussion on the situation, like laser finders, cruise missiles, but yeah, I would say just having one plane to give you some kind of air-to-ground attack is useful, but you don't want to focus too much on it. You want to focus on winning the air battle. This is kind of like an emergency case situation. Then we have helicopters. Now, America has stealth helicopters. You, unfortunately, don't have that kind of option. But you do have really powerful helicopters in terms of transport capacity. So an Mi-26 is going to be able to haul a lot of cargo or a lot of units. Now, it's a tricky affair, but if you do move a significant grouping of infantry through an Mi-26 behind enemy lines, that can give you a significant advantage. With helicopters, I prefer using them for scouting purposes. I prefer using them for transport purposes because, again, like just that kind of mobility they provide is useful. Why I don't like using helicopters is for an attack role. There's very few situations in which an attack helicopter is going to really prove its worth because they are pretty expensive, and what you really want to do with an attack helicopter is you want to give it as many ATGMs as you possibly freaking can. But that's the problem, they are expensive in that role. You can give some IGLAs over here, so a Ka-52 can also deal with enemy helicopters pretty effectively, but again, expense. The way I view these guys, it's like it's an ace up your sleeve. So if an enemy is just throwing a tank rush your way, getting a couple of helicopters in that right moment can really turn the tide of battle. I've played battles like that, where the enemy just massed a huge amount of vehicles and we just threw helicopters on them and annihilated them. You can also go with lighter helicopters for the sake of, transporting a couple of units or just one transport helicopter over here. So something along these lines would probably work. You can also put some missiles over here, though keep in mind the point situation that you're confronted with. But I would mostly use the Mi-26. Not the greatest variety in terms of units, sure, but these are the kind of points we have right here to work with. But yeah, this is mainly for the sake of transporting troops into a battle. That is the primary purpose of this, like just getting a couple of units or 1-2 units over here. That is something you would use. Now, support-wise, your artillery, your air defenses, your transport vehicles. Well, with transport vehicles, you want something that's cheap, fast, can get stuff. Like if you want to move a huge amount of cargo, and by the way, you shouldn't. I never put a lot of cargo in one point because it's very easy to lose it. So having a couple transport vehicles, very, very good. Then we have S-300s. I would have 2 of these, but I would go for 4 missiles each, not 2. The reason I would go with 4 is because you just want that kind of ammunition, because the enemy can throw enough planes to overwhelm air defense, so you just want to have that. But that's not the only type of air defense. Then you have short-range air defense, so something like a Tor. You wouldn't need to get more missiles, like the amount of missiles these things have is going to be good enough. Now, you don't necessarily have a vehicle over here in support that's going to provide you that close range protection. So just one of the difference between Russians and Americans. So you have short range air defenses, you have S-300s over here, but at least with the choices I've made, it's different in other battle groups or specializations. But then we have artillery. So over here I have plenty of points to the left. I would recommend going heavy on the artillery with the Russians. Like with the Americans, it's the choice between tube and MLRS if you want to have your air defenses being good. But in this case with the Russians, you can go with TOS. It's a choice. I personally prefer tube artillery, but I'm not going to lie. Missile artillery is exceptionally useful if you just want to remove an area of the map. Tube artillery is more accurate most of the time. So you do have all kinds of different options, but I would recommend going for the heaviest artillery right here. And get extended range, because that extended range is going to be very, very good when you're dealing with the enemy. In fact, you could even go with more artillery or more transport vehicles or whatever. Just swarm your enemy with units, with all kinds of artillery right here. So, you know, that is the one advantage of the Russians in multiplayer. So right here, that's why I go with like a lot of artillery, good air defense right here. That the Russians do have, at least with these two specializations. So with airborne, so with the VDV and the tank army. Now, tanks themselves. What do you want in terms of the tanks? Well, of course, we do want the Armata, the T-14. And with tanks, my view is go as heavy as possible. Now, there is a bit of a factor to take into consideration in regards to this. Like, you do want top attack missiles, but as you can see, there's no system over here for active protection, at least on the T-14. So the T-14 is really strong as a tank. It's probably the best tank in the game, but it doesn't have that active protection. That's where the T-90 comes in with its Arena APS and its ERA. So you do want both, and you can get a good amount of T-90Ms with Arena system. But that's not all that you can get. You can also get BMPT Terminators with grenade launchers, weapons, additional ERA. Not too many of them, but they are pretty much what you'd view as an APC, though they do also have a good amount of anti-tank missiles. So that's one of the things that the Russians have as an advantage. They have a lot of really good anti-tank missiles available to them. What else would you get? Well, it depends on how far you want to go with certain things, but personally, I would not usually get tanks that don't have active protection. That's kind of one of the problems that the Russians do have. So if we look at a lot of the options over here, you can see that, yeah, they just don't have active protection. So instead, yeah, just have 5 tanks. You could go with more if you want to, but again, you're just going to lack that kind of active protection system. It's just gonna, be felt. I don't think the T-90 has an active, the T-14 has an active protection. At least I certainly don't see it. I imagine it should have an active protection, but I don't really see anything to indicate that it would. Maybe I'm just misreading this tab right here. Anyway, you could go with more tanks. You know, push things a bit much. Like surprisingly, Spruts are pretty solid vehicles. Not like decent durability, decent firepower. They're not gonna do excellent, but like, you know, if you just want to increase the variety over here in terms of tanks, go for it. Recon. And with recon, you can get the tank, though, yeah, I'm not sure I would recommend the T-90M for a tanking purpose. Like, a recon tank is just not gonna cut it as far as I see it. It doesn't have the speed, it doesn't have the range, so it's not really gonna work out. what I would recommend instead is getting drones, as many as you can really afford. And also put missiles on these things, upgraded sensors, so you do have that extra range. And also, yeah, just get a decent level of drones, because drones have a great sight range. Like this one in particular, the Orion drone is really, really solid. And it does have some level of firepower that you can work with. Now, as for infantry, I'd recommend getting sniper scouts, but what kind of vehicle would you want for sniper scouts? Well, that is going to be a bit of a discussion, isn't it, on that subject. So, but I do think that with respect to it, the BMD 4M is probably your best choice for a vehicle. Not phenomenal, but it will get the job done right here. And yeah, just get, let's say, 3 snipers as an example. Get some paratroopers. Always keep in mind, though, the squad loadout. I do prefer having long range rifles over there. RPG launcher. It's a good idea to have a mix of different kinds of vehicles right here. So like light vehicles, if you want something cheap to transport stuff, heavier vehicles. It's always going to be pretty useful from my view. But yeah, just recon is simple enough to understand right here. Now, infantry-wise, you do have a lot of choices. Now, you do have an anti-tank team right here, but then you also have these guys. Now, the fellows right here, they're generally going to do better because obviously there's two of them as opposed to one. But let's start from the top. You have the T-15. You can get a Kinzel module at them. Basically, it's an attack missile. So you do have the B-10 right here, as we can see. And we do have the B-15. Like, go for this one and get some grenade launchers, because grenade launchers pretty good at holding locations if you need to, but they are going to be expensive. So this is one of the reasons you do want a variety of different types of vehicles, because you don't just want to focus on like, oh, I'm just going to get a bunch of T-15s, but then I'm not going to be able to afford them when I actually need them. So it's good to have that kind of level of flexibility with regards to different things. Like you may want a cheap vehicle, or you can just go with B-10s, for instance, right here. Yes, so anti-tank. That is pretty significant. Though I'm not really sold on these guys. They're okay, but they're not phenomenal. So instead, what I would get would be some Iglas. But not necessarily for the Iglas themselves, though that's obviously going to be important, but because of their defense. So you get Su-23s, you get that gun, and you get a bunch of them, or as many of them as you can afford. Having anti-air infantry is useful because you can just station them, hide them in the woods, and if an enemy drone, helicopter, or anything like that shows up, you can easily shoot them down. That is one of the value propositions right there. You do have combat engineers, and you can put rockets on them if you want to. Though different choices, different decisions on that kind of subject. You can up armor BMDs or BTR. Like for instance, put some of these vehicles right here. Though, again, bear in mind the cost. You don't want to go over the point limit. So we are we are pretty much on the point limit. So I'm going to need to probably do some adjustments. Just reduce one of the Spetsnaz right there. Maybe one of the snipers. Maybe 3 is just good enough. Okay. Just to open up more points. And it is the question of like, okay, how much of X number of things do you really want? Like, you know, maybe I can take it out on a truck, just kind of balance this out. Maybe I don't need these vehicles if I want more infantry, or maybe just having one of these. I do recommend firmly having a decent amount of infantry. The reason I recommend having a decent amount of infantry is because that decent amount of infantry is going to play a pretty big role in securing and holding territory if an enemy does show up. So you do want to ensure that infantry is pretty good, but also the B-15 over here, as you can see, like, it does have that Afghan attack protection. It does have those missiles, so you may want to get a good number of these, by the way, as opposed to things that don't necessarily have that kind of level of active protection. So we could go for, you know, much cheaper vehicles right here. Save ourselves some points. And, well, I guess I will just remove this vehicle completely and go with even more infantry. So having a good number of IFEs that can take a hit can be pretty useful. So we do have right here. So in this case, maybe I would actually switch them to the B10s, give them these modules with Afghanids. That would provide the level of power in a group that would prove itself to be very, very useful in an actual battle right there. Because, like, if you can summon a bunch of IFEs that can take missiles and have a good level of protection, because if we look at HP, like 14 HP, like Bradleys, this is one of the advantages that the Americans do have. They have Bradleys, and Bradleys are very strong in terms of being able to soak a lot of the damage that does come their way. But this is the kind of battle group that I would make for the Russians for the sake of multiplayer. Like, just bounce around, plenty of artillery, plenty of tanks, transport helicopters, scouting capability. It's all going to do a pretty good job. Although, you know, missing cornets, not necessarily my finest moment on that subject. I know I had forgotten something on that. But yeah, just make sure you get cornets because of the capability that they do provide. Is pretty useful to have them. And, you know, just continuously balance points, decide what you're going to use, what you're not going to use, that kind of stuff. It is the kind of balancing act you do want to engage in, right? Like, how many Spetsnaz do you need, for instance? You know, just as an example, maybe, you know, you're gonna go with one less drone, but, you know, just all kinds of balancing acts to be done on that in order to maximize your potential. Like, you could go with just 2 Iglas right there as an example. Maybe maybe go with let's see, over there. Or just ditch one of the cornets. And that would be about it. Right. 2 cornets, each of them capable of firing 2 missiles each. So these things can stop armor columns in their tracks. Like, even if they have trophy systems or Iron Fist systems, they're still going to be able to do a pretty solid job. But that's my perspective. Just mostly, though, consider the principles here. Like, you just want to have a bit of everything. With tanks, I would say go for heavy firepower. With infantry, you really want infantry that's in good vehicles a lot of the time, because you can use those vehicles just on their own, right? And if those vehicles can survive on their freaking own, well, that's a pretty big advantage, right? So this would give you air defense capability. This would give you a good amount of capability Like, there's a lot of power over here in this vehicle. Like, may not be the most durable, but just like the sheer amount of missiles that this thing carries is not to be freaking underestimated. That's all I had to say. Christine signing out.